So who in the first round of questions, who wants to start off? Where are the questions?
This is a question to Judith, and about specifically two moments in her paper, or you could say it's a question about pedagogy, by which I mean who teaches what to whom. So the first moment that I understood and that I can see as a sort of magnificent secret that is obviously very well guarded is that the self is survivable because it can give up on its boundaries at some point, and the survivability of the self depends precisely on this ability to understand that protecting the other, to simplify grossly, is a way of preserving oneself with oneself. Okay. So, and I'm tempted to say this is almost what we think that we don't know, since if we knew that, then the moment that you described earlier in the paper about the horror that we feel about certain types of life, if we all knew this, in a sense, the difference would not even have to be marked between the horror blah 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 and the horror that we should feel and the one that we don't. And then the second moment, I guess, is about that other kind of self that thinks that destructibility of others is always virtuous or righteous, and that the self-destructibility is unthinkable. So in a sense, this seems to be a sort of other kind of self. But on the other hand, because we're asking ourselves the problem of who is this we who does not feel horror at the death of certain others, yeah? Why is it that we can't have the two at the same time? In other words, how do I make the other, that unfortunately could also be me, the first type? And how do I convince the second type that is going to destroy that in fact it is making this horrible mistake of not realizing that its own survivability is already at stake because it's killed itself trying to kill the others?
Maybe I take it literally back. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your question. Let me say this. I think, I begin following Assad by invoking a kind of familiar we, which is, of course, an imperial we, and it is emphatically so, right? And because the problem with the imperial we is that it does differentiate itself from a set of others who are not included in the we. And so, I start with that framework in order to suggest that we, and indeed even its binarism, belongs to certain ideas of sovereignty and territory. So I think even, and I think this hasn't been thought about well enough, how a certain political vocabulary of sovereignty and territory actually enters into the discourse of the self of the subject and how that works. I mean, obviously we have Deleuze on deterritorialization, and this is all quite important, and I wonder whether I don't have some affinities there in this paper. So if we think about what I'm, and it seems to me that Klein actually starts to ask, why would we check our destructiveness toward another, or what would be that check? And then it seems to me that she reverts to a kind of psychic, universe that is one's own, and where the subject at issue is caught between wishing to destroy and wishing to preserve itself, right? But always itself, and I think, or it has its own self as its final referent. And then I try to move from there to suggest that she unwittingly formulates an idea of survivability within relationality, which would actually take us away from a Kleinian idea of the subject towards a more relational concept of self, even toward a notion of self as constituted by this sociality without which survivability is impossible. Now that obviously is an idea of sociality that would counter the idea of the we who's based on territorial claims or sovereign claims, right? So the sociality toward which I'm trying to move via a reading of Klein is a is a counter to the idea of sovereignty, of a sovereign we, with which I began.
And the best person.
And the best person. Now, I actually think there's a third move, however, that I would want to underscore here. And that brings us back to the question of affect and interpretation. Because I think what happens with the Guantanamo poetry is that we get an idea of transitive affect, or networks of transitive affect, that are decidedly not only post-sovereign, but counter-sovereign. And I think that that's another idea of what sociality might be, and what an insurgent or a contestatory post-sovereign sociality would be. So there's a we in that poem, and indeed, I actually think that maybe what is most incendiary about the poems are the pronouns. Who's the I? Who speaks when the I speaks? Who speaks when the we speaks? For whom is one speaking? And the you to whom they are addressed. Is there a you out there who is going to receive and register what happens there? So both in the structure of address and in the indexicality of the pronoun, I guess I would say, there's an uncertain, maybe even uncontainable sociality, which goes along with this transitivity of affect that I think takes us and yet maybe specifies the notion of sociality as survivability. I think the poems do attest to the idea of sociality as survivability, but also specify it in some pretty clear ways. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. That's why I wanted to thank I want to thank both of you very much, and first of all, Judith Butler, to your talk. I thought, especially in these days we are living in right now, the events which are happening, so it's really, I think it was all the more urgent to learn how to seize the reality we're living in and to theorize the reality and to find ways of resisting the reality without necessarily becoming suicide bomber or shahid or however you want to call them. But I have a question now to Braidotti, where I tried to just bring down some of your comments to the situation again we're living right now in Europe and contemporary Islamophobia. So just a simple question rather. So you talked about the need for taking into account feminist theory, queer theory, to better sort of find solutions for the future and to frame the future. And you also mentioned the point of, in terms of the destructible body, who's again defined by you as the body who is a female body or a gay body and so on. So I was thinking when we listen to the discourses of contemporary Islamophobia, somehow I feel that there is a sort of simplistic and very popularized form of exactly the revendications these theories in a way try to make or advance in a very popularized and simplistic and stupid form. I agree, but still, I mean, it's sort of somehow dropping into the public discourse and is used exactly to define the inhumanity and the intolerability of Muslim subjects because they are homophobic, because they are sexist. And if you think, for example, I can just take one little example which I think is very striking. In the German case, you have the establishment of a Muslim test, which was coordinated by a woman who belongs to this very quickly growing, emerging species of liberated ex-Muslim feminists, and who had to develop a certain category of questions which should be answered by those Muslim individuals who want to get naturalized as German citizens in Baden-Württemberg. And one of the questions was, for example, your son is coming home today and tells you he's gay, what would you say? And based on his answer will be decided whether you get the nationality or not. So
He'll get what's their
citizenship.
Will they take it away from my mother if she's says how upset she is?
Well, is she Muslim?
She becomes Muslim if she says that she's upset. Only Muslims are upset.
Well, this is exactly the situation I was sketching in the first part of the paper on the our women, their women, and the alliances between a certain, I think it's partly generational, partly political, but a certain sector of the European women's movement and this type of anti-Islam xenophobia. We have eminent examples of this in this country, and from Siska Dresselhaus to the one and only Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has just been awarded the Simone de Beauvoir Prize at the conference organized by Julia Kristeva for the centenary of the birth of Simone de Beauvoir. So the famous homophobe
who actively argues against gay parenting in France. Yay, human rights. Okay,
you may have gathered that Julia Kristeva is not Judith Butler's favorite thinker.
The thinking is, I just...
But this is the perverse alliance, precisely, that we're trying to map out through this work on Postsecular, trying to see how can we both actually recognize that a certain brand of secularism is part of the Western tradition. With the Enlightenment, with the French Revolution, we started discussions on terror, we started discussion on emancipation, we started discussion on a type of legalistic mark of secularism. It's undeniably there, that it's not complete, it's not finished, and in the paper I was trying to pick out the traces of how much of this is really not accomplished, and it is being absolutely used and abused by the neocon, by the right, in the most atrocious manner. The end result of all of this is the difficulty of intervening in the public sphere, and I think it's very, very difficult to put a simple message out there, and I think in some ways we know we need our American friends, we need the Judith Butler, there's only one of those, but we need people from the heart of the empire to crack some space open, because right here and now it's very difficult in the European social space to put a simple message out there. And we're caught between the devil and the blue sea, with a lot of the feminist movement doing what it did in the 30s. It's gone civilizational. They're going to fight for our civilization, and i.e. racist, and totally self-congratulatory about the great achievements of Western feminism. I am proud of the women's movement. I'm proud of everything we've achieved. However, but finding another mode of intervention in the public is terribly difficult, with the Vatican shooting the way it is, with all the monotheistic religions really cracking down the social space, with the transformation in the structure of the university, where we are so fortunate to have a Center for the Humanities, and we hope to be able to have discussions like this, but it's really quite special and quite rare. So the university becoming degree factories and not spaces of critical theory is an issue. And last but not least, the transformation in the war machine. The metaphysics of death, which are so crucial to philosophy, have always conceptualized war in a sense as the embodiment of a certain type of metaphysics of death. Well, wars today are industrial sort of logistical complexes. They're companies, they're businesses, and farmed out, outsourced, and a great deal of what happens, and even in the jails, is to do with a certain type of managerial model of governance. It actually bears very little relation to that old model of the army with the nation state and ideas of national identity. It's a completely different set of dislocations. Now, these are the analyses that we need to do, but the spaces for this are very sort of much rare. So I'm very glad that we have it in the university. It would be much better to be able to go out and hold it in the public. I think it would be a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I also have been struck by we the people. There was a little tendency of putting Assad in the position of not having thought about all these things, say we, a kind of diversified we, which is probably something like we the American people, we the liberal, secular, humanists, think of things in a certain way. I certainly also have thought about the poor in other category. but these are short texts, and of course have relation to other work he has done, and he has been arguing very much about socialization of so the relation between language socialization and the formation of symbols and therefore of affects. And he relates that very much to the question of power and of institutions, movements, and what have you, in society, creating a certain kind of sociality, etc. So the we is actually formed through certain kinds of social processes. And I think I have not heard much about those social processes in both of your talks. It seems as if these things are already kind of constituted in very early childhood relationships. That may be the case, but I think the other side of it, the movements and the institutions' power as such, may be interesting to look at, and also the kinds of mediations which it make possible. I was struck by the fact that I actually got a little bit affected, as it were, by the poems. So there is something in the language of poetry which is actually quite dangerous. In the sense that it may indeed be a danger for national security, as indeed it was in Russia during the period of using poetry against it. Yes. Yeah. So there are forms of mediation which are making certain things which have been rendered visible in other ways, and creating therefore what Rosi, I think, is pointing at, the kind of solidarities which are the bread and butter, as it were, of social movements. So the analysis of mediation seems to be very important to understand what kind of we is constituted. Now the question I have is, how are these solidarities, national or otherwise, or counter sovereignty, although sometimes the sovereignty has, of course, movements within sovereignty which are counter that sovereignty in a sense. So there's always opposition, or resistances which are part of the constitution of that sovereignty itself, as far as I can see in national sovereignty. But I was wondering about, say, invisibility and rendering through certain forms of mediation certain kind of victims invisible, and creating them as fearsome or dangerous, or actually in a way connected, invisible and dangerous. How is the effect of fear being created? That seems to be indeed, in the term terror, one of the possible translations. The extent to which these things are linguistically mediated, I think, is very important, because indeed that poetry is only accessible in this gathering here by a rendition in English, and therefore makes certain kinds of communications possible, and therefore certain kinds of solidarities possible, which were not possible visionarily. So I wonder whether you have some ideas about the effect of fear and the invisibility through certain forms of mediation.
All right, well, let me just say, there are many issues you've raised, and I probably won't be able to address them all adequately, but let me give it a try. You know, in a longer piece, I'm interested in Talal Assad's rhetorical strategy, and I think it's quite brilliant. But I did say explicitly that I understood him as invoking the we, and even putting himself temporarily in it as a heuristic strategy, right, to produce a certain kind of sympathetic identification in order then to call into question the sympathy that sustains that identification. So I think he's incredibly knowing about what he's doing, and he knows what he's doing. I mean, what's also kind of brilliant, right, and I've seen this, especially in France, I mean, try to actually give the book to somebody who's part of a dominant human rights framework, and they almost take it, they're not sure, should I read this, should I not? Assad, you know, what's his view? You know, what's his background? What does he think about suicide bombing? Is he against? is this a moral argument against? So, well, actually, he's asking us to understand it. You know, well, so Assad is already suspect, right, as the author of suicide bombing. Can I take Assad on suicide bombing on the plane? You know, it's hard. I left it at home once, and so did Saba Mahmoud. And I thought, Saba, you know, your passport is bad enough. I don't know what you're worrying about. Anyway. She's already in lots of trouble. Anyway, but, okay, so who's Assad? You know, suicide bombing, it's not against, it's just suicide bombing. It's not for or against, right? So then he begins with the we. So he knows that there's the suspicion through which the book will be received, because everyone wants to receive it through an accepted moral framework. And then he enters the we, and starts deliberating on the we who wants the immediate moral framework. Right? So I actually think it's brilliant. I think it's maddening. Right? I think it drives his readers crazy, because he's baiting them, which is also what I said. But I think he's enormously, I can't think of anyone who's more critical about the use of the we. And for him to just insert himself in the imperial we is also just, I think, is terrific. Anyway, so yes, of course, he knows what he's doing, but he's also deconstructing that category through inhabiting it in an unpredictable way. Okay, so, you know, one of the reasons I work on this is precisely because of that, I think, extraordinary heuristic move. I think psychoanalytic theory can inform cultural analysis, social and political analysis, without necessarily being developmental. And so I don't think that all psychoanalytic theory begins with childhood, for instance. It may have something to say about childhood, but the analysis of tokens within the media, which Rosi was talking about, the analysis of ambivalence or destructiveness, although it might have an etiology in childhood in some ways, is not finally crucial for the analysis of the mechanism as it's described by Klein or as it's appropriated by me. I think we make a mistake when we imagine that something like dependency on the other or survivability only in terms of interrelationality or sociality is just something children have, but that as adults we individuate and we're beyond it. So I actually want, if anything, what I'm trying to do is destroy the temporality that goes with the developmental understanding of psychoanalysis. Not that I'm against all developmental models, but I am destroying it here in order to suggest that none of us ever overcome that primary dependency that we associate with childhood. And in that sense, none of us ever overcome childhood. And political agents, and George Bush never overcome, and we never can, and we never will. Well, but I think that this is the importance, right? You know, it's not as if one moves from one stage to another. I'm not accepting that. I do think the media is important, and in fact, I mention that the media is, in my mind, the way in which these interpretations of what is horrible and what is not, what can be responded to with horror and what cannot, I think it has enormous power. And I've written extensively, for instance, on the Abu Ghraib photos and what happened there, what was selectively chosen among those photos for public consumption, public reaction, the trials over whether or not the full the full set of digital imagery would be made available to the public is extremely interesting as well. The way in which the government thought that if those photos were shown in full, that it would galvanize an anti-war effort, that it would make Americans look like torturers in the eyes of the rest of the world. They were extremely aware of what the dissemination of that imagery would do. And indeed, I would mark the change in public opinion in the U.S. toward this war. I would mark it as 2004, when most of that imagery became available. Although, as you know, it's not until Salon actually won its lawsuit that all of it is now available. But enough was available to shift public opinion. Similarly, what's really interesting about the poetry is that the only reason we have this poetry is that the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York sent its people in there, along with various lawyers and various medical people who all decided, who saw that there was this poetry writing that was going on in the styrofoam cups, and said, look, you know, freedom of expression, there's no reason why they can't have artistic expression as part of their prison experience. Here's what the Red Cross has to say, here's what the Geneva Conventions has to say, and of course, the US government doesn't give one damn about any of those protocols, but it did, under pressure, finally supply the pens and papers, and then a number of those people took the Center for Constitutional Rights, thinking, who are these lawyers? Who then got in touch with specialists in Arabic poetry, and Ariel Dorfman, you know, to write an introduction and a postface to this. This is an enormous network of people who you would not always put together, right? Arabic language and poetry specialists, human rights activists in New York, Ariel Dorfman, who, you know, has been writing about literature and torture for decades, you know, analogizing it to the Chilean situation, Red Cross workers, medical people who are trying to get pens and pens. This is an extraordinary set of networks. In the same way, I think we have to think about a different kind of networking, which is the cell. The construction of the cell is precisely the idea of the invisible and fearful sociality, right? It's never fully mappable, it's never fully knowable, it's never fully representable, and as such, it's constantly eluding the schemes of representation that are available for understanding it, right? It can strike anywhere and everywhere, it's not locatable. I think the construction of the notion of the cell by the government and media both, and of course they're now happily married in my country for the most part, has done a huge amount to not only produce fear in a certain location, but also to displace fear. I mean, why aren't we frightened of American military power? Why aren't we frightened of what Israel is doing in Gaza? It seems to me that we don't have overwhelming fear. The we who's being constructed by this media construction does not have overwhelming fear about state-sponsored violence the way it has it about this idea of the cell. Anyway, I'm sorry, go on.
Two quick points on the Assad and the psychoanalysis. I do fail to be impressed by Talal Assad's undifferentiated block of otherness. And I'm not impressed by that for two reasons. One is quite simple, part of my daily politics. It does erase 30, 40 years of race, feminist, post-colonial theory. It's just at one stroke. Example, the question that you asked, how is fear created? How are patterns of social invisibility created? Two areas of scholarship immediately jump to mind. Years of feminist work on rape, how the political economy of rape is an economy by which every man keeps every woman in a state of fear. Questionable theory. Nonetheless, 30-something years of research, empirical, theoretical, with prototypes, modalities, policy advice, and methods by which we can actually have a sort of a social theory of how fear is constructed. Another area, race studies, how whiteness is constructed as an emblem of fear in the black imagination. Fundamental for any person, white or whitened, to have a look at how that type of fear works and how those homicidal patterns of relationship to others are socially constructed and implemented in concrete institutional everyday gestures that work fantastically. So, you know, the prototypes, the paradigms, the methodologies are there. Why are they not being looked at? So I've decided to go back to what is a proto-feminist almost, saying there's no point complaining that we don't have, you know, fresh ideas and model when we are erasing 35 years of critical theory. So that's one, and I haven't studied the text with your rhetorical skills of finesse, I must say. Second point, on psychoanalytic theory. I think psychoanalytic theory is wrongfully neglected in contemporary social theory, to the exception of people like Zizek, who are histrionically imitating Lacanian, what was it, jets of spray and genius, as we were saying the other night, and have a function, or some sort of social function, not very deep, but so it's not particularly helpful. But psychoanalytic theory, indeed, not so much in terms of the development of the self, but as in the meta-psychological phase as a social theory. As an anthropologist, Peter, you're probably very suspicious of this, but if we're trying to explain contemporary phenomena, whether it is the residual spirituality of media culture, or the profound and widespread banalization of violence, I think some of those theories need to be brought back in. I think in your discipline they're probably less absent than they are right across the board, even in cultural studies. And the psychoanalysis is simultaneously trivialized. Everybody talks about fallacies and not understood. I mean, the unconscious processes and the death charge that they bring with it are fundamental to the understanding of the new forms of proto-fascism that we're in. And somewhat, it's a reservoir of ideas that we're not tapping. The other defense of psychoanalysis I would make, more Nietzschean in a sense, is it is a critique of morality. It takes the veneer off this kind of moral high grounds that we tread upon when we're trying to explain the horror of violence. What psychoanalysis explains beautifully is the indifference to the misery of others as one of the basic reactions of the human being. Better him than me, better her than me. And the profound indifference is linked to this logistic, the zeroing out operations, that kind of fundamental neutrality or amorality of what I would call the libido and sexuality. Questionable again, but we need to have a look at that. And I think the combination of Freud and Nietzsche in a critique of morality in an age of both paganism and neo-moralism is something that I miss. I think we need that combination of those two critical thinkers. Do you want to put that in?
A quick question to both of you. Firstly, the phrase, or the question you asked, what makes affect effective as affect, and stuck in my mind. When you said, what makes affect effective, I thought, okay. And you say, what makes affect effective as affect, to me it implied something that you argue elsewhere, which is that affect is not the starting point, but in your argument you talk about what seems pre-moral or, in a sense, almost pre-discursive, is open for interpretation, is open for being made intelligible. So intelligibility coming before affect. And I saw that as a kind of, which I tend to like, which is trying to get out of this affect first and then we go into analyzing it. So if you could say a little bit more about that relationship between the pre-intelligibility of affect, that argument, and that intelligibility precedes affect.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And to connect that to you, then one concrete way I thought about affect and sociality is precisely about feminism and what happens to feminism and let's say gay and lesbian rights today. And one thing that I notice affectively is I get scared when I hear someone sounding like a feminist or a gay activist, not because I have to now get into secularist talk, which was your question about secularism, but because I don't know how to talk feminism or gay activism, because that has been hijacked, which you brought up. So rather, it seems to me instead of going on about secularism and how do I respond to that threat, the more urgent question is how to be a feminist, or how to be a gay activist, because that discourse has gone. So they have been, I would say the right populists have been very good at creating a sociality based on affect. While for us, it might be good to respond on those terms rather than, go into the how could I be secularist today? Or just end with something like what Spivak said, which is, I would love to be a secularist, but Israel doesn't allow me.
Gay action would say that.
Can I just suggest that this question kind of draws together a nice dialogue between, so that you guys also dialogue between yourself.
There's something like this. Yes, in fact, well, you'll be glad to know that the sentence you're thinking about talks about interpretive matrices for the understanding of war and opposing dominant interpretations that not only act upon affect, but take form and become effective as affect itself. So it's the interpretations that become effective as affect. Okay, and where I'm actually drawing on is Nietzsche on the Will to Power, where he talks about affect as not being primary. In fact, as being a worked over bit of experience. coming to us already interpreted. So that is what I think. I think even when we talk about destructiveness, it's differentiated, right? The question of, we might say there's a kind of generalized problem of destructiveness and following Klein, but the minute it takes form through a particular interpretive matrix, and it's selective, right? Who's destructible and who's not? And how do we think about those interpretive matrices that distribute destructibility in unjust ways? I guess I would put it, and that's where my normativity comes back in. I think, one question that seems crucial to me is that in Rosi's talk, she referred to the psychoanalytic postulate that the I who would be destroyed, the destructibility of the I, is unrepresentable. And that seemed to be a kind of general postulate that gets derived from psychoanalytic thought. It's interesting, the question of whether the destructibility of the I is unrepresentable. Because I want to be able to say that the fact that a highly masculinized notion of the national subject in the US understands itself as indestructible, right? Which is a different issue. But I want to say that's a problem, and that if there were a sense, an apprehension of the precariousness of life, and if that were distributed in ways that didn't make one population stand for destructible life, right, while another population stands for indestructible life, then we would be better off. So I don't know what to make of that general claim that the I cannot think its destructibility. It seems to me that the I has to entertain its destructibility in order to become aware of mortality, precariousness, transience, and to have a basis for the sheltering of life itself. And I don't know how to reconcile those.
We've started a discussion on meta-ethics, I think, at this point. I'll start with the affect and then see if we can pick up, because I also had a question to Julie similar to yours on affects. It is a fact that this hijacking of feminism, human rights, gay rights in the public arena makes it very difficult to embrace those causes. At the same time, I am not one for retreating and let the right take my political culture easily. So it's a question of what other grounds there would be for positive, whether we want to call it solidarity or empathy. And I think the moment that question is asked, the critique of the Hegelian binaries enters, and what I call the switch to the Deleuzean Spinozist model for me works. And it works because it essentially does two things. It poses the conditions for solidarity in sort of parallel but dissymmetrical and incommensurable processes of becoming. There's a becoming woman of man that is not a becoming woman of women. There's a becoming Jewish of Jews that is not a becoming Jewish of Muslim. Processes of becoming. And the logistics of that, the transformations that go with that, the ethical coding of that, lies the ground for something that would be a movement, an activity of intervention in the world. The discussion of this is enormous, of course, but there is a quick answer. Connected to this, I think to make sense of affects, at least in my scheme of thought, they have to be de-psychologized, and I think Julie would agree with this. We're not talking about emotions or feelings. Affects are, and I was trying to get at that through the death drive discussion, essentially neutral quantities of forces. And they are the ways we impact upon each other. And the model of the libido here is completely right. I think Freud and Melanie Klein are more relevant today in some ways than Lacan, because it is really quantitative. It's forces, and the affects are ways in which we register, we code, we measure, if you want to be like this, the impact of certain forces. So positive and negatives being the basic coding in classical sort of Spinozist terms. I think that the fundamental neutrality, the morally neutral nature of affect is what makes them interesting. And I think there's a point that I find of great interest and difference between Judy and me. To go back to what you just said, it would be nice if the self could do all the things that you just mentioned, recognize the precariousness of others, be able to embrace the vulnerability of others. Those are normative, moral statements that I fully embrace. I just don't see how we're going to sort of reconcile them to what we know about the structure of subjectivity, hence my emphasis on the death drive and your own interest in the fundamentally productive nature of destruction, the Melanie Klein genius in this. Actually, all of this produces forms of relation to other, gratitude, melancholia, depression. There are modes in which we can internalize and live with our comprehension of others. So how can we walk the moral high grounds knowing what we know after the 20th century in history and critical theory? So it's this desacralization, and my question to you was, you talked about interpretative schemes prior to the expression of affect, a tacit interpretative scheme prior to affect. Now, is this your Derridianism? Is this your linguistic mediation crawling back in?
We never get over certain relatives, it's true. I want to say two things, and it's interesting to me that we're moving in very different directions, sort of high theory, but serious politics too. Let me see the theory thing. I don't know if I can go with the quantity argument.
No, not the thing.
I mean, it seems late 19th century. I mean, I kind of liked it, when I read it in the, outline for a scientific whatever. But Teresa Brennan, I don't know the quantity thing. I think I am probably more indebted to phenomenological ideas of affect as actually about something in the world, that it's commenting, responding to, that it has a kind of interpretive, that it's visceral and interpretive at once. And I want to hold to that. And I actually think you would like that, so we can talk about it. It could be called neo-vital, but I think it's not. I think it's not. But the thing about the death drive, I mean, we can't change the subject to get rid of the death drive. Stillness is offered by Rosi, the ability to handle stillness, which I think is very interesting, to stay with stillness. It's very compelling. I'm going to have to think about that. But I also think there's a way of cultivating or sustaining aggression in democratic life, which is through open antagonism. And open antagonism that can be held by a polity, that can be sheltered and produced and sustained by a polity. So there might be some open antagonism. And I think Le Cloud Move obviously used that productively. And I continue to think that it's an important idea. Which is also why I think we have to see the terrain of contemporary politics, especially on the left, as a terrain that has to be kept open to certain kinds of antagonism. So, if Ayaan, Hirsiali accepts Susan Okin, well then, we need a really strong argument about why Susan Okin was always wrong, right? She was. She was always wrong. She was always wrong. And what does it mean to say, oh, there's a feminist position here, and then there's a relativist approach to other cultures, and other cultures believe in these horrible practices that feminists must oppose. So in order to maintain our moral judgments, we really need to just say they're wrong, right, and be right in the name of feminism. And of course, there was always another feminism, which was intimately bound up with the anti-racist, and continues to be intimately bound up with anti-racism, cannot exist without anti-racism. It's the only possible feminism that would have women of color as essential to its operation rather than as an add-on or an afterthought or a, pluralistic something or other. Feminism has always been about countering homophobia, which is why, one has to make those links, and one has to also remind the libertarian gay movement that its idea of freedom is not the same as the notion of freedom that social justice projects have been working for a really long time. Those freedoms actually depend on complex community actions rather than individual liberties. The individual liberty argument that's being made in this country on on behalf of gay conservatives, gay reactionaries really, is one that actually also feeds the state and gives the state the power to protect its liberties, right? And the state is going to take that power to protect those liberties and use it precisely in order to produce a civilizational discourse for the state, to whiten up not only Holland but Europe, to use it to rationalize coercive anti-immigrant policies. And then the question is, are we still part of a social movement? Because if you're a social movement as a radical gay, lesbian, queer, trans, bi, intersex person, you're going to be fighting against that use of state coercion, because that use of state coercion can be used against any minority, religious minority, sexual minority, women. I mean, the alliances have to actually form around a critique of state coercion and a critique of a racist civilizational process which is being reproduced as national identity. And that's very different from saying, I'm a woman and therefore I have this perspective, and you're what? You're Muslim and therefore not a woman? And you have this perspective, and our two perspectives are incompatible, and we can't be relativists, so you're wrong and I'm right. You know, I mean, that multicultural model is precisely the one that takes identity to be fixed and totalizing and forgets that really strong alliances are based on a critique of coercive state power and a critique of certain forms of nationalism. And that's the way, that can be the only way we galvanize the left with alliances. And then if there are open antagonisms between members of people who are gay or people who are from other religious traditions, then you find the terrain, you find the institutional venues, you find the pedagogic means, you find the artistic and cultural, venues through which to have open, interesting antagonism, and find out that subject positions are not as totalized as the multicultural model would insist, right? Because they never are. They never are. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, one of the things that the torture at Abu Ghraib did was it sought to reduce the tortured subject, the Iraqi Muslim subject, to the embodiment of sexual taboo. This is who you are. You are nothing but sexual taboo, and we will break you there, right? You are the taboo against masturbation, you're the taboo against homosexuality, you're the taboo against nakedness, blah, 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 blah. Well, what do we really know about, how the taboo against homosexuality works in various different Muslim cultures that are also cosmopolitan, complex, and urban, and I mean, even in most anthropological analyses of taboo, when a taboo exists, that just means the practice finds another way of taking place than through some overt means, right? It's what Eve Sedgwick taught us about marriage. Like, marriage is great. You make the contract, and then it permits for all of that other sexuality, right? I mean, so we don't even know what we're talking about. We don't even know what we're talking about. But the idea of the reduction of a so-called Muslim subject to the taboo on homosexuality is itself just, it's an insane moment. I'm sorry, I could run through.
There was one more question, right?
I don't know to which extent it would address, but I was wondering why you were also when you were discussing about the disruptive power effect of poems. I was wondering, what struck me to mind was another paradox, or at least something I observed also with myself, being very, very involved and very concerned about the developments in Palestine. To a certain extent, on a daily basis, we are confronted with the images coming from Palestine, images from almost, dead babies, dead corpses, people who show that's people. But to a certain extent, it doesn't affect me, I also must confess, it doesn't affect me to the same way as the poems did. And then I wonder, to which extent, what is the disruptive power of poems? Is it because poems do something that image do not? Is it because we have been so conditioned to watch certain images and are less conditioned to listen to certain voices? Or is it also because of the anonymity of those voices that are not visible to us, and the fact that we do not see that they are Arabs, to a certain extent, to say it very provocatively, but I mean, is there something there? I'm wondering whether there is something.
Great question. It's an excellent question. You know, it's what Susan Sontag spent most of her life trying to think about. And in '78, she said something really interesting. She said, photography can only shock, but it cannot inform, and it cannot interpret. And what we need prose, she said, prose, my prose, in order to inform us, so that the caption on the photograph became really important for her. And she actually cites Walter Benjamin on photography to support her early view. She then kind of goes back in her book on the suffering of others to say, well, maybe it's not true. You know, maybe photographs do interpret, or maybe there is something to be said about making sure photographs are given publicity. But of course, she's writing this, and she still valorizes writing in a certain way. She doesn't actually think about poetry, she thinks about prose. I think that, you know, it depends on how you see those photos. It's true, it's time and again, women, children, death, funerals, wailing. How is it presented? How is it presented by the media? It's presented more here, by the way, than it is in the US. You see more, but you also get more channels. So you can also, you know, get Al Jazeera, and it's not easy to get in the US. What would it mean to actually build interpretive communities around those visual events? And to have them not just be kind of repeated in the numbing way, but actually framed and reframed and taken up and discussed. If you heard Mahmoud Darwish on Gaza, it would make a difference. And indeed, he wrote a really strong poem when Hamas and Fatah separated, right? And Hamas won, and he saw the Palestinian people destroying one another. And that poem read aloud on Al Jazeera had more effect in that region than almost any other cultural event of the time. But we don't get Darwish. I mean, I don't get Darwish on television. And what would it mean to have Darwish or Hanan Ashrawi, you know, all the time being the people we turn to? Okay, so tell us what's happening in Gaza, you know, Mahmoud. That would be incredible. It would make a very, very big difference. But it's not what we do. It's what we see. It's what's over there. And it recapitulates the relationship of distance rather than bringing it into the public sphere and the interpretive communities that are trying to make sense of what's going on and what best to do about it. That's a lame answer. It's just my start.
I haven't seen this time.
Okay.
We have one more question. Can we take it? Yeah?
That's to be the last one.
Okay, it's going to be the last question. And I don't know if the mic is coming all the way. You have to move it.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question that is related to the last one, because it has to do with the poems. And I was thinking about your reference to the categories of I and we, also as subjects of speech. And I was wondering what happens in this process of translation. What happens when we have Arabic poems and translate them into English? And as far as I know, we have a very different process of constitution of subjects of speech in Arabic and in English.
Yes.
And how would you bring this into play?
Yes. Well, ideally it would be brought into play. And it's unfortunate there are only 2 pieces that I know that have been written on the Arabic, and I do have several people who can help me with the Arabic, but I haven't had a chance to do that yet. But it does make a difference. And what, of course, is extremely interesting, and what I would like to know more about, is how pronomial reference works, you know, and how the indexical works. And for someone to explain to me how we understand longing in relationship to the I, for instance. I think that that process of translation would be crucial for expanding our understanding of what kind of networks of suffering and agency are in the poems themselves. So, you know, I feel like I'm working with what I have right now. And I'm not sure I can get access to the original Arabic. That's also a question of what's censored and what's not, and whether these poems are actually allowed to circulate in Arabic language. I am not certain. And I have a plan in April, actually, to go talk to the people at the Center for Constitutional Rights who collected them, and to find out both the history of censorship and where the original poems might be. And let's hope something can come of that. I just wanted to say, can I just say one thing? I just wanted to say that I agree with Rosi about affirmation. And I think one of the things these poems, I think the poems are really amazing because it is pain and suffering, as you say. Obviously, it's pain and suffering, longing, rage, but it's also living on and talking back, and breaking out of the cell in some way, trying to break out through the language one sends out. There's quite fierce activism in it, you know, and I just think maybe. What's important is to try to figure out what are the methods through which nearly unbearable pain gets transformed into activism. Maybe not redeemed as activism, right? But what are the means or methods of transformation? I think that's crucial. And I also even think that that publicly grieving a life, that the claim to public grieving can be a kind of activism. I think Antigone showed that in an interesting way. So. I will just leave it there.
Thank you.